Julie Fison has written a compelling novel for adults, One Punch, and it's a contemporary domestic drama. It follows two mothers at the centre of a tragedy. And if you're a fan of Liane Moriarty or Celeste Ng, you're probably going to like Julie Fison. She's no stranger to writing. She's also written 11 books for children and young adults, a play, and is a former journalist. However, One Punch is her first novel for adults. Thanks so much for joining us today, Julie.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
Congratulations on your book, One Punch. Wow. For people who haven't got their hands on a copy yet, can you tell us what it's about?
Okay, the premise is really simple. A young man is fighting for his life after being hit in a coward punch, and his mother wants revenge, and the perpetrator's mother will do anything to keep her son from jail. So very, very simple premise to start with.
What made you think of this idea?
Okay, I had been thinking about this probably since 2016, which was when my older son finished school. So he's just ready to start university. And something really tragic happened in our community. It didn't happen to my kids. It wasn't a boy I knew, but a boy in the same age as my son was attacked in the Valley, which is the nightclub area in Brisbane. He was punched, unconscious, and sustained catastrophic brain injury, and he died the next day. It was so tragic for his whole family, the whole community, but even people who didn't know him. They were really affected by it because it was such a random attack that everyone felt like that could have been my son, out there. He's just starting to go out to nightclubs, just turning 18, the same as this boy. So everyone felt kind of really vulnerable. And I think parents and the same thing had happened in Sydney as well. And laws were changing as a result of this. But we all felt like this is something we needed to be aware of. And it didn't matter how many times we reminded our kids that this kind of thing happens, be careful, stay together. I was hearing the same thing every week, that someone else was being assaulted on a night out, on a Saturday night out. They were going out with friends and ending up in hospital. And then one friend said that her son had been punched unconscious and then kicked repeatedly in the face while he was down. And it was so distressing. It's distressing for her, obviously, much more than me, but I really felt like this is something I need to write about. So I decided that I had been working on children's books for quite a long time and had decided to move into writing books for adults. And I thought, well, this is the story that I really want to tell. So I sort of set about doing the research for it, etc.
All right, so that was back in 2016. Then obviously then there is the aftermath of that. I remember when that happened in Brisbane, and it was just absolutely awful. You are no stranger to writing because you are a journalist, but also you have, as you mentioned, written children's books. Was this the trigger to make you want to write a different kind of book?
I think I had got to the stage where I'd written 11 books for kids and young adults. I'd written a play, I'd written some short stories. And so I just was looking for a change, really. And I wanted to write for people like me. I guess I wanted to write a story that my book club could enjoy, the sort of story that I would like to read, because I think I just like variety. When I wrote for kids, I wrote for younger kids and kids in between. And also my kids had grown up. So my kids are now 21 and 24, so not really kids anymore. And I had lost the voices around me. And I know there's lots of writers who just stick to writing middle grade fiction, well into their 60s and 70s. But once I started losing those voices, I just found it much more difficult. And I wanted to, I think, reflect things that were going on in my own life and my own community. And I guess I had young adults, and I wanted to write a story that sort of brought that together, the young adults and the parents. I had lots of stories from the sidelines of rugby pitches and cricket pitches and basketball courts, etc. So I had a lot of mothering stories. I've got, great support network, or a great friendship network of mothers, and everyone's got boys, because I've got boys. You kind of accumulate a lot of friends with boys. So I just felt like it was the right story for me to tell. It was a story I wanted to tell. But initially, when I started thinking about writing for adults, I had initially thought, well, I just want to write an adventure story for mothers, a bit like my first Hazard River story series, which was kids kind of getting out and getting into trouble. I thought that would be a lot of fun. I wanted to write something fun for mothers and the center of adventure, but I thought, oh, this is going to be my debut novel. It really has to be something quite important. So I actually, I prevaricated over this story because I thought this is going to be a really tough story to write. It's very confronting. It affects people. It's topical, so people have strong opinions either way. I didn't want to dive into something and people feel like I was exploiting their grief. So I thought this is going to be a really tricky story to write. So I was a little reluctant to tackle it. That's why I kept going back to maybe just an adventure story where the mums go on a road trip. That sounds like a lot easier. But the story kept coming back to me. So I just thought, okay, this is something I've got to write. But once I started investigating it more, I could see the story from both sides, because obviously I think the first thing you think about is the victim and the victim's family, and how would they feel, how would they react. And then the more that I started looking at it, I was hearing stories of boys who'd been jailed for assault, and they were boys the same age as my sons. They were from good families, they went to good schools, and it wasn't the classic kind of stereotyped thugs who out looking for trouble every Friday and Saturday night. These were kids that made a catastrophic mistake and they'd gone to jail. One boy 8 months for a head injury, and I'm certainly not excusing violence at all. And then another friend told me of a boy who was 18, punched someone in a fight outside a bar in the UK, and he fled the scene, and his parents marched him back to the police station, and he was jailed for 18 months. And it just really made me think, okay, there's another side to this story that I need to investigate. And I think my background in journalism made me want to see the story from both sides. So I've written the story from the point of view of the two mothers at the center of the tragedy. I decided not to include the voice. There's plenty of dialogue from the boys, but the story is told from the two mothers. And so the chapters alternate between the two, because I wanted to explore both sides of the story and see where I would come down. And I don't think I could make that decision without being in that position. But, from people who've read it, they're saying, I found it really difficult to choose sides, because it's not as straight. It's not always the thug be the victim. Sometimes it's much more nuanced, and that's the story I wanted to explore.
Yeah, that's the thing, isn't it? And I think that it's so powerful that it's written from the points of view of the two mothers, Yasmin and Evie, because these are women who are around my age. These are women who are my friends, who I can see in my friends. And it is so real, and it's so powerful. Now, when you say you wanted to investigate, both sides and obviously do research, as you mentioned, when you decided you wanted to write the novel, what did that look like? How did you investigate? How did you research?
So initially online, so there's lots of stories of victims, and it was heartbreaking, absolutely heartbreaking to research it, because I was just reading these stories and these, parents who'd been, left with kids who, very severely, with severe brain injuries or worse. And, in also understanding brain injuries, how that all works. and also just talking to people. But I didn't want to talk to victims personally, apart from my friend whose son very much kind of inspired it initially. I didn't want to speak to victims because it's a made-up story, and I didn't want to exploit their grief. I didn't want, it's not intended to be a true story, although it's, you know, it's got elements of truth. There's lots of truths in there, but I didn't want someone to say, well, I gave you my story and what have you done with it? You know, it's a really difficult, you've got a massive responsibility as a journalist. You have that responsibility. You've got someone's story. What are you going to do with it? But this isn't, it's a work of fiction. And so apart from that, I also have a very dear friend who's a neurosurgeon and lots of other medical people. So I was able to talk to them about brain injuries. You know, I've got a friend who does Pilates. She's in the Pilates reformer beside me, who's a speech therapist, a couple of other, you know, people, lots of people in the medical field. So I was able to say, okay, if this happens, what's the result? How does this, you know, how does this pan out? What are the consequences? And the thing that they often told me is it depends on the injury. It depends, you know, on the recovery. These things, the brain is a very tricky you know, apparatus. So it's very vulnerable, but it's also very unpredictable how an injury might, you know, pan out. So I use that in the story as well, because, you know, there is always this uncertainty of what's, you know, what's going to come next. And also when my neurosurgeon friend was describing brain injuries and I was just having that, okay, slow down, getting information overload right now. I also wanted to use that in the story because Yasmin faces that when she goes to the hospital and doctors and speech therapists and occupational therapists, and you have so many medical people coming to tell you things, and it's really hard to take all of that in, isn't it? You know, especially when you're stressed about, you know, your child being there, it's very difficult. So I also wanted to use that. So I used my own experience of my medical friends trying to explain everything to me. But I was very pleased when Sally Piper, who's another Brisbane author, read the book for an endorsement. And she's also a nurse, so she's a very specialist nurse. And she said, yeah, it all holds up, because that was my biggest fear, of course, was that, you know, I hadn't quite matched all the information that I'd been given. But she said, yeah, it all, you know, several medical people have said, yeah, no, it all stacks up. You know, it's like, do you have, so I was very pleased that I had managed to get it all together, and it does stack up. And I'll probably say that, and someone will say, you know, someone will come back and go, yeah, not quite, not really. But, you know, I felt like I did everything I could to research it and make sure that it was as tight as it could be in terms of facts.
So you spend a period of time researching, investigating, that kind of thing. When did you know you were ready? Like, when did you kind of go, okay, I've done enough, I'm drawing a line in the sand and I'm actually going to start writing? And then how long did that take, and how much time did you dedicate to that, like, per week, to give us a bit of an idea?
Yeah, so I started writing it in 2020, and that was, of course, the start of COVID. So as it worked out, I was very thankful that I had something to do, and I took over the lounge room and just put my head down, and I just worked really intensively. That was just my full-time occupation. And you know, I just got my head down in 2020, and I think I knew I was ready when I had the two mothers. I had decided to take it from the point of view of the two mothers. Before that, I had only seen it from the point of view of the mother of the victim. And once I had realized that the story was from two sides, from two characters, then I knew I was ready to get started. And I was still quite nervous that I was exploiting other people's grief, and, you know, I was still nervous about the topic, you know, and it's a confronting topic. And, you know, I've, like all of my friends have loved the story, except for one person who told me she couldn't read it because she's right in the middle of that situation where her kids are going to the valley every Friday and Saturday night. And, you know, like I went through a couple of years ago, waiting for the key in the door every Friday and Saturday night, waiting for the Uber to pull up. So she said it was just too close to home. But the story isn't just about
No.
that tragedy. It's about family connections. It's about choices. You know, there's humor. There's a lot more to it. And it's not just, I know it sounds like a really sad, traumatic story, but there's actually a lot more that I wanted to put into the story.
So you had the benefit of COVID in a sense, because you could focus. Talk me through your writing day. Like, how long did you spend every day with your bum in the chair, and how long did your first draft, or the draft where you were, you know, sort of happy with it, how long did that take?
Yeah, that took me probably 4 or 5 months, something like that, full time.
Yep.
And I like to write first thing in the morning. So, you know, get up, maybe walk the dog, or sometimes before the dog gets up when we had an old dog, but now we've got a puppy, so there's no chance of getting out before the puppy gets up. So get in early and just start writing. And normally
what's early? What's early?
In Queensland, it's 6 a.m. You know, that's when you kind of want to get up and get started, and or go for a walk, and normally I would have a Pilates class or, you know, something like that. But through COVID, I didn't have I had no distractions. So in a way, it was the perfect time to be writing a debut novel. Unfortunately, everyone wrote their debut novel during COVID. So when I started to submit it to publishers, they're like, we are inundated with manuscripts right now because everyone has written their debut novel in 2020. So it's like, well, that's great because everyone's reading as well, right? It's like, oh, it's really difficult because, you know, people just weren't back in their you know, their jobs, and they, you know, didn't have everything going on. So it was a little trickier, but I was happy that it was a great time. So just really intensely, like I'll work for a couple of hours, have a break. I might have 17 cups of tea breaks in between, but, you know, try and put a couple of hours in. And I write like that because I like to write like that. It's not really this is like, I don't set a timer. I'm just, once I'm into something, I don't want to get up and I don't want to be distracted. But I'll jump up and do some little jobs around the house because that is the advantage of working from home, isn't it? And so I might do a 4-hour block overall, and, you know, might get back to it in the afternoon. But I have to say, I had COVID at the beginning of this year, and I found that this year I have been a lot less productive. You know, like I'll do a morning and then the afternoon is just like a write-off. I'm just too tired to concentrate. So I have actually found that's really slowed me down, but I'm working on my second novel right now. So that's been a whole nother pressure. But initially for One Punch, I was putting in 8-hour days easily, maybe more, 10, 12 hours, you know, when I was really into it, especially that first draft. And then I might sort of stop and go, oh my goodness, I've got no idea what happens next. Even though I had a plan, I had a bit of a plan. I knew where the story started. I saw the scene. I saw exactly where it all started. Not in terms of the punch, but in terms of where the mother was. I knew exactly where she was going to be holidaying and where it all finished. And then I had some detail in between. But as I was writing it, I was starting to stumble, and towards the end, sort of the end section. And I think that's always the hardest, because you think, oh, I know exactly where it's going to go. And then you get there and you go, oh, right, well, my character wouldn't really do that, and that's not going to work because that actually doesn't happen in real life. And someone tells you something and you think, oh, that's not going to work at all. So, you know, you might have, like, I might have a week off or something like that, working it out, or doing lots more research and investigating, like researching courts and, you know, going through court manuscripts and working out what might happen in court, and I ended up throwing out that scene anyway, but after spending a lot of time doing the research, and calling people, and it's like, what happens when this happens? And like big days, but then I might have some time off, and still plenty of time to go and have a game of darts with the with the crew, and on a Friday afternoon, COVID lockdown darts and family time. So yeah, it worked out really well.
So at some point you decided to enroll in the Australian Writers Centre's crime and thriller writing course. Why did you decide to do that course, and what did you get out of it?
Yeah, so I really wanted to give myself the best chance of success. So I did a couple of courses, and I also did a copywriting course because I, wanted to jump on that as well. I wanted to make sure I understood suspense properly. And it was really about the suspense, because even though it's not really a crime story as such, it starts with a crime. And it's a mystery. It's a gripping story, and it's a bit of a thriller, I suppose. But suspense to me is really important. And I think coming from a background of writing kids fiction, where you need to keep the pages turning, you don't want to lose your reader. So it was really important to me to have a cliffhanger at the end of each chapter, and just to be able to have things moving along. So I wanted to understand how suspense worked and anticipation, and that was really useful. But I think, somewhere along the line, the most important thing that I got out of it was what motivates your character. And for me, if I start to get stuck in a story, it's because I don't understand what's motivating my character. It's like, where are they headed? Otherwise, you've just got characters appearing, drifting through scenes, haven't you? And sort of appearing here and then drifting off. It's like, where is this going? Okay, I know where the plot is going, but why are my characters driving it in that direction? So, and that's a big part. That's a big part of keeping the story moving. So I feel like that was part of the crime and thriller writing, was understanding that is the essence of everything. I think that's what I took away. Lots of other great things from the course, but that's the one thing. And I also took away that Louisa Larkin loves dogs, so we are connected to our dogs now.
She sure does. She sure does.
So
now,
that's so great.
The suspense part, you've mastered that, because it is a page turner, and from that first chapter, you just go, "Oh my God!" and you absolutely want to know what's going to happen for the rest of the story. Did you take that at the start of when you had already? When did you do that? Can you remind me?
So
had you already started your manuscript, is what I meant?
Yes. So I knew that's how I wanted to write the story. I knew I wanted to write the story right from page one. You know what this story is about, because that's the sort of book I like to read as well. And I guess, that's the essence of crime fiction, isn't it? Like page 1 or 2, find the body. Page 350, find out who did it. And so, that's what appealed to me with that course. And that's what I wanted to do the whole way through, to kind of get to every chapter. And there's another question. It's like, oh my goodness, who said, why did that happen? Who said that? Why was that going to happen? So I knew that was the structure that I wanted. I wanted it to be a page turner. And so I found the crime writing reinforced what I was doing, and gave me that sense that I was on the right track, and that anticipation is really crucial. And I think with a classic crime novel, you don't know who the murderer is until the end. But in this story, it's the mothers don't know what the other one does. So we're as a reader, we're often in a privileged position. We're not 100% in a privileged position. We don't know everything, but we do know things often that the other mother doesn't know. So you've got that, I guess, dramatic irony, isn't it, that you, and that's another form of suspense, isn't it? So you've got that anticipation. And, you know, it was just great. You know, I love a course because you're with other students and you're all working on your own thing, but you're throwing in things to each other and seeing how they stick and seeing how they work. So, you know, I love the chance to connect with other writers and connect with a tutor. And, you know, I would have loved to be in Sydney and, you know, be in a class, but being on a Zoom call through, that was also through COVID, because that was kind of the, you know, right in the middle of COVID as well. So it was, yeah, it was really great. It's really, you know, you just need that reinforcement all the time, I think, because if you're writing a story that you're going to submit without any invitation as such, then is this the right thing to be writing? Am I, you know, on track here? But if you've got people saying, yep, you're on the right track, and, you know, that sounds great, or, you know, any reinforcement is great, isn't it? Any encouragement is good, because you're never really quite sure until you submit it and get a rejection or, you know, an acceptance.
I think what you said was really interesting, that the reader sometimes knows what's happening with both mothers, but, you know, one mother, they're not necessarily knowing what's going on with each other, right? And that reflects your friends in real life, right? That's why I say that these women in this story are like my friends, because sometimes I know what's going on in both lives, right? But they don't know. And it's I think it's a really realistic position for the reader to be in. You mentioned that you're writing your second novel. So is it in the same kind of ilk?
Yes, yeah, it is. So that so this one, my second book, is another book with a Firm Press, and it is another contemporary family drama. So another drama on the streets, people, you know, things happening in a street near you. And it's a little different because the mothers are quite a bit different from the mothers in One Punch. So obviously I had to, you know, find a completely different story, but it's also another drama that, you know, parents will be able to, yeah, that's something like that has happened to me, and, you know, how would I respond in that situation, and how would I feel? And there's 4 voices in this story rather than just 2. So it feels a bit different to write. It has felt very different to write, actually, because I got the contract to write that story last October, and it's due in a couple of weeks' time. So I've got a year to write it. And like I said, with One Punch, the idea had been ticking over in my head for a couple of years before I actually sat down and was ready to write it. But this time, you know, I submitted a paragraph, a story idea, and we talked through it with the publisher, and she's like, okay. So I got going, but I got going from a standing start. So it took me a few months of writing. Oh, right, now I understand what the story is. I knew what the plot was. I knew where it started. I knew where it finished. I knew a few scenes in between, but I hadn't really, and this was, again, the character's motivation. Oh, that's what's driving her. That's what's driving him, you know, that always makes a difference to me, you know, and I'll stumble along through the chapters until I understand what my characters are trying to achieve in the story.
So you pitched your second novel to a firm because you already have a relationship with them. Tell us how you got the book deal in the first place.
Yes. Okay. So go back
for the first novel, obviously.
Yes, sure. So 2020 was writing the story, writing One Punch. 2021, I did a lot of editing, but I started submitting it from the start of 2021. And then there's a conference called the CYA conference, and they have the opportunity to pitch to publishers at that conference. And again, it was online. And so I just booked slots with 4 publishers that I thought would be interested in my work. And, you know, when I read through their kind of bios and what they were looking for, I thought, yeah, this is something they might be interested in. And I had a great reaction from a firm and one other publisher, and then, you know, reasonably interested from the other two publishers. And I sent my manuscript off to a firm. They got back to me. Kelly Doust got back to me 2 weeks later, and
Wow.
I got an email, and Kelly had written, you know, really love your story, and I'm looking for the but, you know, I'm scanning through the email looking for, but it's not for us, you know. I think, you know, when you've done this for quite a few years, you steel yourself. Every time you get an email, you steel. You're excited, but you're also steeling yourself. So you're not too disappointed if it's a rejection. And I had a contract, you know, literally the next day. So it was actually
How fantastic.
It was a really quick turnaround. And, you know, I think just being able to pitch to someone directly. I had sent my manuscript pretty much to everybody, and agents in the first 6 months of the year, and kind of got nothing back. And I think that's this volume that comes in, and you know, like, publishers just don't really have that time unless it's something very specific that jumps out at them. So it's so fantastic if you've got the chance to pitch face to face and get your story across. And I think mine being a really simple premise, one punch, you know, even the title pretty much says it all. And, you know, being able to pitch it really easily, and they know exactly what the story is going to be about once I say, you know, it's the voice of 2 mothers. So instantly they're able to picture what it's going to be about. So I think that really helped, having like a really crystal clear idea of what the story was, and to have it quite simply in my mind, as well as, you know, the story is quite a simple premise.
So what's the grand master plan now? Have you left children's books behind, and is this now your thing?
Yeah, I think so. You know, I never say never. But I'm really enjoying writing for adults. I actually really loved writing One Punch. It was a really difficult subject, and it was quite hard to get started. And it really did take me a couple of years to, like, okay, I'm ready. But once I got into it, just having the chance to tell all of my mothering stories and all of those stories I've sucked out of other people over the years, and, you know, it was just great to share stories of motherhood and parenting and choices and the tough things, the tough decisions that we have to make, and we're never sure if we're right. And I think every age that you get to, you think, oh, this is the tough one. And it's funny because you think your kids turn 17, 18, okay, that's it, we're hanging up the parenting boots. But of course it's not like that. It's, you know, you've still got a lot of responsibilities, and a lot you can share, and a lot of direction you want to give them when they walk out of high school.
Now, a trap that some journalists fall into, oddly TV journalists, and this doesn't make sense when you hear the rest of the sentence, but you did not fall into this trap at all, is that I've read books written, you know, fictional books by seasoned journalists, very good, very, very good journalists, that then are really overladen with the facts and research of whether that's the setting or some history or something in the characters, you know, maybe a peripheral character who might be a real person. And it's very heavy to go through and doesn't add value to the story. And I'm not I mean, I can understand why, because when you're, you know, writing a piece, when you're producing a piece of journalism, you need to make sure all your facts are covered and all of that. And you have to ensure that the reader knows all of the key points. But that's not, the reader doesn't necessarily need to know all of those key points in fiction. Did you ever feel tempted to overstuff because of your background?
I think I don't know that I do. I really understand what you mean, and that's one of my pet dislikes when I'm reading a story, is like, oh, a really heavy dose of information. It's like, I've done all this work, it's going into my story,
Yes.
and I'm quite conscious of that because I know I don't like to read books like that. But I think my background sometimes influences me to want to tell the real story. This is what actually happens. This is the only way it can end, because this is what actually happens in the real world. And my publisher is always, yeah, but this is a fiction. This is a piece of fiction, isn't it? It's not a piece of journalism. So this is a story, and it's got to be a good story, and the readers have got to be happy with the story. We're not telling them what actually happens in the real world, because they can read a newspaper or, watch the TV for that. So that is often, something that that I have to overcome, and I have to really be pulled back from, but that's not what happens out there. I feel kind of compelled to tell the truth quite often. And I know when I started writing books for kids, I did find it quite difficult to go beyond that. This is what actually happens, and the kids would be going, yeah, but that's really boring, Mum. But, how about the crocodile comes in and, there'd be a lot of things happening. And I'm like, I don't think that would really happen in real life. And, so it took me a while to actually pull back from that. And I still do fall into that trap where I want to just tell the story that actually would happen, and not necessarily, that's not necessarily a great ending. So, but thankfully I have a great publisher who pulls me.
You've done a fantastic job. Done a fantastic job. So congratulations on One Punch. So let's end with, because this is your debut adult novel, and it's going to be obviously the start of many more adult novels for you. What are your top 3 things that you know now, but you wish you knew before writing One Punch?
I think if you've got the chance, let the story mull over in your head before you get started. Give yourself time. Previously I would, idea would snap and I'd be bang, 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 just something really random. And then I get, 10, 20,000 words in, and you be, oh, okay, that's not really going to pan out into anything. So I think a little bit of planning for me is useful. So a little bit of planning goes a long way, and making sure it's, it's like I've got an idea in my head. I think the other thing is write a story that you really, really want to tell. Don't just write a story because you want to write a story. Like, if you've got a story that you really want to tell, that's so much more likely to get picked up by a publisher. It's really hard to get published. There's so much competition, and there are so many books being published as well. So it's hard to be successful even once you published. There's a lot of competition. So give yourself the best chance by writing a story that's really, really important to you. Do a course, do a few courses. I'm quite late to the course kind of train. But every time I do a course, I learn something new. I find out something, it's not quite a silver bullet, but they're really useful things, tools that I've been able to use. So I'd say let the story, tick over in your mind, do a course, a little bit of planning, but don't stick slavishly to your plan, because your characters will want to change things. And the other thing is about character is, make sure you understand the motivation of your character. What does your character want out of this scene, out of this story? And that will make it so much easier to write, to finish your story, and not just get to 20,000 words and go, no idea where I'm going from here.
Brilliant. And on that note, congratulations again, One Punch by Julie Fison. Everyone, get yourself a copy. You won't regret it. And thank you so much for your time today, Julie.
Thanks so much for having me, Valerie. That's been really great.